Imagine a place designed not for cruelty, but for perfect silent control. A single corridor of 4 by 8 foot cells where men are stored, catalogued, and quietly fed into the cold machinery of the state's new, humane gas chamber. This was Condemned Row at San Quentin, 1934, a system engineered to make death a clean, bureaucratic transaction. But on August 21st of that year, the silence shattered. The very architecture of isolation meant to pacify instead ignited a violent revolt that exposed a fatal flaw in the blueprint of modern justice. This is the dark story of how a prison's quest for order built a pressure cooker of human despair. We're going inside the forgotten revolt to dissect the moment the machine of silent death broke down. Stay with us to uncover the truth. The last sound was the trap. A heavy, oiled thud of wood against wood, followed by a sharp, brief snap. Then the silence of a body twisting slowly on a rope. The date was May 1st, 1931. The place was a converted shower room inside San Quentin prison. The man was James Tex Carlin, convicted of murder, and his death was a problem. He was not the first to hang at San Quentin, but he would be the last. The audience for this final performance was small, hand-picked. A few reporters, some state witnesses, the required doctors. They stood on a wooden platform, looking down into the 8-foot-deep pit where the gallows stood. It was a messy, intimate business. The hangman, a former guard paid a fee for his grim specialty, had to calculate the drop based on the man's weight. Too short, and death came by slow strangulation. Too long, and the head could be torn clean off. After the drop, there was the waiting, the twitching, the final pronouncement. Then the body had to be cut down, the noose carefully removed, the corpse bagged and carried to the prison morgue for autopsy. Every step was visible, every sound was heard. The spectacle of it, the sheer visceral craft involved, was the issue. This was 1931. California saw itself as modern, progressive. It had outgrown the gold rush, survived an earthquake, built gleaming cities. And yet its ultimate act of justice was a medieval ritual, dependent on the skill of a part-time executioner in a shower room. It felt archaic, undignified. For the state, it was a logistical headache. For the witnesses, it was a haunting. For Warden Court Smith, standing stiffly in the corner, it was the end of an era. He made a note to have the gallows dismantled. The state legislature, he knew, was already reviewing a new method. Something cleaner, something silent. The solution arrived not with a bang, but with a legislative vote. In 1933, California passed a bill making lethal gas the state's sole method of execution. It was championed as an act of humanity, a scientific advancement. The electric chair used elsewhere was seen as gruesome, a violent, jerking death that could burn flesh. The rope was a relic. But gas was different. It was described as like falling asleep, peaceful. The proponents spoke of chemistry, not cruelty. They argued it was more reliable than a hangman's knot, cheaper to maintain than an electric chair's generator. It transferred the act from the realm of the artisan to the domain of the technician. Death would become a procedure, not a performance, a transaction, not a spectacle. The law was the new rulebook. It codified the end. Now Warden Smith just had to build the machine. There were no blueprints. No state had a permanent gas chamber of the kind California envisioned. So inside the prison hospital building, in a basement room, they built it from scratch. It was an octagon about 12 feet in diameter, with walls of thick steel plate sealed behind plate glass windows. It looked like a submarine's airlock or a bank vault. The purpose of the windows was for observation. The witnesses would now watch from a safe, detached distance through glass. Inside, a single heavy wooden chair was bolted to the floor, with leather straps for the wrists, ankles, and chest. Beneath it, hidden from view, was the mechanics of death. A copper bowl, connected to a lever outside the chamber. Into this bowl would be placed a pair of cyanide eggs wrapped in silk. Below the bowl, a shallow pot held a solution of sulfuric acid and water. The procedure was a grim recipe. Strap the man into the chair, seal the airtight door, give the signal, pull the lever. The lever would tilt the copper bowl, dropping the cyanide into the acid. The resulting chemical reaction would produce hydrocyanic gas, a colorless, odorless vapor that would rise and fill the chamber. It would inhibit the body's ability to use oxygen. The condemned would, in theory, simply lose consciousness. It was clinical. It was engineering. But during initial tests, using stray dogs acquired for the purpose, they found flaws. The seals around the door leaked, a faint almond-scented trace of gas escaping into the observation room, sending technicians coughing into handkerchiefs. The gas didn't disperse evenly, pooling in corners. Engineers tinkered, adding a small electric fan inside to circulate the air, reinforcing the door gaskets with rubberized asbestos tape. Finally, after months of adjustments, it was pronounced operational. A gleaming, silent steel and glass machine waiting in a basement. It had no purpose but one. It awaited its first subject, but a machine for death required a waiting room for the living. Concurrently, San Quentin's North Block underwent its own transformation. The second tier was stripped and redesigned into a dedicated unit, Condemned Row. This was not just a cell block, it was an architectural statement. The old barred fronts were replaced with solid steel doors, each with a small hinged food port about face high. Each cell measured 4 feet wide by 8 feet deep. A man could lie down, stand up, and take 2 paces. That was all. The doors faced onto a central corridor the guards called Broadway, a long, narrow canyon of concrete and steel. At each end, elevated guard stations were built, giving officers a clear, unobstructed sightline down the entire length of the row. There were no common areas, no dining hall, no day room. The design philosophy was one of radical isolation, sensory deprivation. The solid door meant a man could not see his neighbor, only hear the muffled sounds of the block. The small barred window at the back of the cell looked out onto a blank wall or an interior court. The intent was psychological pacification. By removing stimuli, by eliminating community, you removed the will to cause trouble. You created a state of suspended animation. The men transferred into these new cells experienced a silence deeper than any they had known. The clang of the door closing behind them was final. It was the sound of being filed away. With the architecture in place, the protocols followed. Warden Smith and his head guard, a stern disciplinarian named Bernard Barney Flynn, formalized the rules for Condemned Row in the spring of 1934. They called it the Silent System. The name was literal. Inmates were forbidden from speaking to each other at any time. Communication with guards was to be functional, minimal. Yes, sir, no, sir, and I need the bucket emptied. Talking was a punishable infraction. The daily routine was a metronome of control. 5 times a day, the count, faces at the food ports to be checked against the logbook. Meals were pushed through the ports onto tin plates, eaten alone in the cell. Once a week, if behavior was good, a man would be let out for 20 minutes of solitary exercise in a bare, high-walled concrete yard. A cart with approved books, mostly religious texts and Western novels, would come by occasionally. A lawyer's visit was the only break in the monotony, conducted through bars in a separate room. The rule, unspoken but understood by every guard, was this: you are not here to live. You are here to wait. You are inventory. The guards were drilled to enforce the silence, to maintain a professional, emotionless distance. Fraternization was a firing offense. They were not keepers of men, but operators of a system. Their job was to maintain the quiet, orderly pipeline that led, inevitably, to the basement of the hospital. That pipeline had its first test on December 2, 1934. The subject was Albert Kessel, condemned for murder. The system swung into its choreographed motion. In the early morning, guards opened Kessel's cell on Condemned Row. He was walked under heavy escort, down the tier out of North Block, across a prison yard, and into the hospital basement. This was the last mile, but it was a quiet, administrative procession. In the anteroom of the chamber, he was formally identified by the warden. Then, he was led into the octagon and strapped tightly into the wooden chair. The leather belts cinched over his wrists, his ankles, his chest. The door, nearly a foot thick, was swung shut with a soft hiss of its seal. Through the glass, Warden Smith looked at the prison's appointed executioner, a trusty inmate who had been trained for this moment. Smith gave a silent nod. The executioner pulled the lever. In the chamber, The cyanide eggs dropped into the acid. A faint wisp of vapor, barely visible, began to rise from beneath the chair. Kessel took a few deep, involuntary breaths. His head nodded forward. His body went slack. The witnesses watched, in silence, through the glass. For 11 minutes the gas did its work. Then the large exhaust fans were switched on, scrubbing the poisoned air through a series of chemical filters. A doctor, wearing a gas mask, entered the chamber with a stethoscope to confirm the heart had stopped. From the moment Kessel entered the chamber to the doctor's pronouncement, 11 minutes, the system had worked, flawlessly. It was clean. It was quiet. It was, in the words of the press, humane. Back on Condemned Row, the men heard the news, or felt it in the changed tension of the guards. The machine was no longer an abstraction. It was real. It worked. And with its success validated, the population on the row began to grow. The waiting room started to fill. The silent block began to hold its breath. The silence after Kessel's death was not peaceful. It was pregnant. It was the silence of a machine settling into its rhythm, the quiet hum of an engine built for one purpose. On Condemned Row, the days began to fold into one another, a seamless grey tapestry of routine. The system, having proven its terminal efficiency, now focused on the logistics of storage. The men were logged, tracked, and maintained with the cold precision of parts in a warehouse. The day was demarcated by the count. 5 times, like clockwork, the call would echo down Broadway. Count time, faces to the ports. The solid steel doors would clank open, each inmate required to press his face into the small barred opening so the passing guard could match flesh to the name and number in his ledger. 7 a.m., 10 a.m., 1 p.m., 4 p.m., 9 p.m. Each checkmark was a verification that the inventory was intact, that no piece had gone astray. Between these punctuations came the other rituals of containment. The slop-out. A trusty inmate under guard would wheel a reeking cart down the corridor, stopping at each cell. The occupant would slide his waste bucket through the food port. It would be emptied and rinsed with a splash of disinfectant and slid back. The process was brisk, impersonal, a sanitation chore. Meals arrived on a similar cart. Tin plates of stew, beans, bread, pushed through the port. No utensils that could be fashioned into a tool. Men ate with their hands or with spoons of soft, bendable pewter. The sound of the row was a symphony of muted industry, the scrape of tin on concrete, the thud of the food port closing, the tread of guard boots on the concrete walkway, the distant clang of gates from elsewhere in the prison. The human voice was largely absent. The rule of silence was enforced with a battery of punishments: loss of yard time, confinement with hands cuffed behind the back through the food port, a transfer to the even more barren disciplinary cells. The message was clear. Sound was a commodity, and you were bankrupt. The only scheduled reprieve was the yard. Once a week, if a man had no infractions, his cell door would open at a designated time. He would be cuffed, walk down the tier and out into a small high-walled enclosure of bare concrete, open only to the sky. There were no balls, no equipment. A man could walk in circles or stand still, or look up at the rectangle of grey California sky. A guard watched from a raised gun tower, a shotgun resting casually across his knees. The yard time was 20 minutes. Then, the cuffing, the walk back, the solid door closing once more. It was less an exercise period than a calibration check. A brief exposure to open air to prevent complete psychological collapse, a maintenance procedure for a living organism. The prison library cart came by less frequently, offering a selection meant to pacify or proselytize: well-thumbed Bibles, dime store westerns, agricultural manuals. For most, the primary occupation was the appeals process. This was the paper purgatory that defined their existence. A man's life was no longer measured in seasons, but in court dates. The appeals process was a labyrinthine journey of writs and motions, snaking from the row to the warden's office, to the California Supreme Court in San Francisco, and to the governor's desk in Sacramento. It was slow, expensive, and capricious. The state bore the cost of the mandatory automatic appeal, but any further legal action required a lawyer, and lawyers required money or charity. The arrival of an attorney was the most significant event in a cell's calendar. It meant contact with the outside world, a voice that spoke of strategy and precedent rather than orders and counts. These consultations happened in a special visiting cage, where inmate and lawyer spoke through a mesh screen, a guard standing just out of earshot but within sight. Hope and despair swung on the hinges of these meetings. A stay of execution, arriving by telegraph sometimes just hours before a man was to walk, was not a victory. It was a reset. It meant the silent clock was wound once more. The endless waiting granted a temporary reprieve. It stretched the tension like a rubber band, thinning it, making it more brittle. The system had to accommodate these legal vagaries. An inmate with an active appeal was treated identically to one with a date set. Same cell, same silence, same routine. The machinery of storage was indifferent to the legal machinery grinding away in parallel. It simply held. By 1935, the logbook began to show the strain. The row had a nominal capacity of 70 men, based on one occupant per 408-foot cell. But the appeals process was creating a bottleneck. Men were entering the system, transferred from county jails after sentencing, faster than the gas chamber could process them. The first solution was pragmatic: double bunking. A thin, lumpy mattress was added to the concrete floor beside the fixed steel bunk. 2 men now shared the airless, closet-sized space. The population ticked past 50. The logistics grew more complex. The count took longer, as guards had to verify 2 faces per cell. The meal cart had to carry double the portions. The slop-out required double the buckets. The silence rule became harder to enforce. 2 men in a sealed box will eventually whisper. The guards, trained to observe, began making new notations in the logbook. Next to names, they scribbled codes: A for agitator, NC for non-compliant, S for sullen. The human material was not behaving as inertly as the blueprint had assumed. The guards themselves were a select group. They were chosen not for brutality, but for a specific kind of stoic detachment. Bernard Barney Flynn, the head guard, wanted men who could follow the protocol without question, who could view the inhabitants of the row not as desperate human beings, but as units of responsibility. Their training emphasized procedure over empathy. They worked 8-hour shifts rotating through posts, the 2 elevated stations at either end of Broadway, the yard tower, the escort detail for lawyers or doctors. Inside the block, they carried no firearms. A riot baton and a whistle were their only tools. The real weapon was the system itself, the isolation, the control of all movement. Communication between posts was done with a series of bell pulls and runners. Conversation between guards on duty was discouraged. It led to inattention. Fraternization with the inmates was the ultimate sin. A guard was there to observe, to report, to maintain the silence. He was a technician monitoring a complex social engine, trained to spot the first sign of a misfire. This culture of detachment was tested, and sometimes it cracked. In late 1935, a veteran guard named O'Reilly was reported by a junior officer. His offense. During the evening meal service, an inmate in cell 14 had asked, through the food port, if the World Series score had come in over the guard's radio. O'Reilly, a Giants fan, had muttered, "Yanks won, 4-3 in 10. It was a fragment of normalcy, a tiny thread of shared humanity. The junior guard reported it as a breach of protocol. O'Reilly was not fired, but he was quietly reassigned to the less sensitive duty of the prison laundry. The message to the guard force was reinforced. The silent system required silence from everyone. The humanity of the keeper was as much a threat to the system as the humanity of the kept. Yet, humanity persisted. In the absolute quiet, the men learned to listen to the architecture itself. The solid doors muffled sound but did not eliminate it. Voices, lowered to a bare whisper, could carry in the concrete canyon if timed between the guards' footfalls. The plumbing, a network of pipes running from cell to cell, became a crude telegraph system. A tap on a water pipe in one cell could be heard in the adjacent one. A simple code evolved. 1 tap for attention, 2 for yes, 3 for no, a series for letters of the alphabet. It was slow, fraught with misunderstanding, but it was connection. It was a direct, physical subversion of the system's core principle. They also used the vents, whispering into the grills that provided meager air circulation, their words distorted but sometimes intelligible to the man in the next cell. The guards knew it happened. They would sometimes hear the faint, susurrant murmur, like the sound of wind in a tunnel. But by the time they reached the cell front, it would cease. It was a ghost in the machine, impossible to fully exorcise. More overt signs of resistance began to appear. Guards making their rounds would discover messages scratched into the paint of the cell walls with a fingernail or a smuggled bit of wire. Crude calendars marking days, names of loved ones, obscenities directed at the warden or the state. One inmate, a former carpenter, had managed over months to pick a small hole in the mortar between two concrete blocks at the back of his cell, not to escape, but simply to see a sliver of the yard outside. When discovered, the hole was hastily patched with fresh cement, and the man spent a month in disciplinary cuffs. These were not acts of major rebellion, but symptoms of a fundamental pressure. The system was designed to suppress the individual will, to reduce a man to a passive object. But the will, like water, found cracks. It seeped through in whispers, in scratches, in the desperate shared tap on a pipe. By mid-1937, the pressure was becoming structural. The population surged past 80. The double-bunked cells now sometimes held a third man on a mattress on the floor, his body wedged between the wall and the leg of the bunk. The row was critically, dangerously overcrowded. The machine's components were straining. Meal service slowed to a crawl. It could take over 2 hours to feed every man. The scheduled 20-minute yard times were often cancelled altogether. There simply weren't enough hours in the day or guards to escort the sheer number of men. The slop-out process, always unpleasant, became a rushed, foul-smelling ordeal, with buckets sometimes overflowing before the cart arrived. The 5 daily counts, the bedrock of control, now took so long that they bled into each other, tying up guards and creating windows of lowered supervision. The air in the block changed. It grew thicker, hotter, laden with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale food, and disinfectant. The silence, once enforced, now became a different kind of quiet, a tense, simmering hush like the moment before a thunderstorm. The guards felt it. Their logbook entries grew terser, more anxious. Block is tense, inmates restless, overcrowding severe. The official prison reports to Sacramento began to mention the congestion on condemned row, always couched in bureaucratic language, but the concern was palpable. The system was operating beyond its design specifications. The flawless engine was overheating. Then came the summer of 1938. It was a season of legal chaos that shattered the last illusion of orderly process. A wave of execution dates was set by the courts, a push to clear the backlog. Notices were delivered to cells, formal typed documents stating the time and place of one's termination. The block tightened like a clenched fist. Then, just as suddenly, stays were granted. Appeals were accepted. Dates were vacated. Then reset. The administrative predictability that was the system's pride collapsed. A man might be told on a Monday he would die on Friday, receive a stay on Thursday, and then get a new date for the following month. The psychological toll was catastrophic. The promise of the silent system was a grim certainty, an orderly, predictable journey to a silent death. Now even that certainty was gone. Despair, which had been a slow, cold drip, now curdled into something hotter and more volatile. A collective, focused rage. The men were not just waiting to die, they were being toyed with. The legal machinery was mocking the prison machinery. Rumors passed through the pipe-tap network, and the vent whispers ran wild. The most persistent and terrifying was that the state, frustrated by the appeals, was planning a mass execution. A group of 10 or 12 would be taken together. The gas chamber would be used in rapid succession. It was logistically absurd. The chamber required nearly an hour per execution to purge the gas, but in the pressure cooker of the row, it felt plausible. It framed their enemy not as a distant court, but as the prison administration itself. The will to simply endure, to wait passively for a legal outcome, evaporated. It was replaced by a raw survivalist imperative, to act, to seize control, to break the machine that was, in their eyes, preparing to grind them all into oblivion. The spark came from a practical grievance, magnified by the atmosphere of dread. A group of inmates, their yard time cancelled for the 3rd week in a row, protested through their food ports to the passing guard. They were told to shut up or lose meal privileges. The response was not submission, but a coordinated volley of shouts, a raw animal noise that shattered the enforced quiet of Broadway. Guards rushed to the cells, batons drawn, but the shouting died as suddenly as it began. The men had made their point. They could break the silence together. In the aftermath, the ringleaders, men with nothing left to lose, their appeals exhausted or their spirits broken, began to plan in earnest. The pipe-tap code buzzed with a new urgency. They identified weaknesses, the electronic lock mechanism on the cell gates, which opened all doors on a tier sequentially but with a slight delay, the morning yard time when the greatest number of cells were opened at once, the fact that the guards inside the block were armed only with batons. The plan was simple, born of desperation and a crude understanding of the system's logistics. They would not try to escape the prison. That was impossible. They would seize control of the row itself. They would take guards hostage. They would use them as leverage to demand a meeting with the warden, to air their grievances about the overcrowding, the cancelled yard time, the chaotic execution schedule. It was a bid for recognition, for a voice more than for freedom. On the evening of August 20th, 1938, the final message was passed. From cell to cell, through vents and desperate whispers when the guard's back was turned, it travelled. Tomorrow, when the door opens for yard time, we go. The men spent the night in the dark, hot cells, listening to the breathing of their cellmates, feeling the pressure of the 92 other hearts beating in the silent block. They listened to the regular tread of the guard, a sound that had measured their confinement for years and now marked the countdown to its rupture. The machine, perfected for silent storage, was primed with 93 pounds of human desperation. The silence that followed was no longer one of control, but of coiled violence. It was the last quiet moment. The morning of August 21st, 1938, began with the familiar metallic clatter of the food port on cell 14. Inside, Frank Cavanaugh, a bank robber facing the gas chamber for a guard's murder during a botched escape, blinked awake. The routine was a religion, and this was its matins. A tin plate slid through the opening, bearing a scoop of cold oatmeal and a slice of bread. The port snapped shut. Cavanaugh ate in the grey half-light filtering through the small high window. He could hear the same sequence repeating down the line. Clank, scrape, clank. At 7 a.m. sharp, the call echoed down Broadway. Count time, faces to the ports. He stood, pressed his cheek against the cold bars of the small opening. He saw the guard, a young man named Peters, walking slowly, ledger in hand, ticking off names. Peters's eyes met his, held for a second, moved on. No recognition, just verification. Cavanaugh heard the guard's voice, flat and official. Cavanaugh, present. The logbook entry for 7 a.m. would be pristine. All present and accounted for. Population, 93. The number was a dry fact in ink, belying the physical reality. 93 men occupied a linear space designed for 70. They were packed into cells like rounds in a magazine. The pressure was not a metaphor. It was a thermodynamic fact, a density of despair that strained the very bolts in the steel doors. The count completed, the block settled into its morning silence. But it was a different silence. The usual sounds, the cough, the rustle of paper, the sigh, were absent. It was a listening silence. In cell 22, Mario the Wire Santora, a small-time hood from Los Angeles with deft hands and exhausted appeals, knelt by the toilet pipe. With a fingernail worn to a nub, he tapped a sequence. 2 quick, 3 slow, 1 quick. In the next cell, it was repeated, and the next. A neural network of desperation, firing its final signal. The plan was fragile, based on a dozen whispered assumptions and the hope of coordinated chaos. It relied on the system's own procedure. The first yard group was scheduled for 8:30. 6 cells on the east end of the tier would be unlocked sequentially by the guard at the control box. The men would be cuffed, led out singly, and escorted to the yard. The plotters' intelligence, gathered over months of observation, suggested a delay of about 7 seconds between the unlocking of one cell door and the next. That was the window. When the first door clanged open, the men in the first cell would not exit. They would wait. When the second door opened, they would erupt together. overwhelming the one or two guards in the immediate vicinity before the control box guard could react and halt the unlocking sequence. They would take his keys. Then, they would release others. At 8:25, the tension was a taste in the air, coppery and sharp. Guard Peters and his partner, an older man named Dobbs, took up their positions. Peters would handle the escort. Dobbs would man the control box. The protocol was clear, a dance they had performed 100 times. Dobbs pulled the lever for cell 1. A heavy thunk echoed as the electronic bolt retracted. Through the small window of his booth, Dobbs saw the solid steel door of cell 1 swing open. The occupant, a man named Henderson, shuffled out, his hands already held behind his back for the cuffs. Peters stepped forward, cuffs in hand. Everything was normal. It was at the moment Peters clicked the second cuff around Henderson's right wrist that the plan deviated. Henderson, instead of turning to be led away, suddenly dropped his weight, pulling Peters off balance. Simultaneously, the door of cell 2, which had just unlocked, flew open. Two men, Kavanaugh and his cellmate, a hulking murderer named Reese, burst out. They did not head for the yard gate. They moved with a shocking, focused speed straight for Dobbs in the control booth. Dobbs, his training kicking in, slammed the lever back to lock, but the sequential mechanism had already sent the signal to cell 3. Its door was unlocking. He fumbled for the alarm bell pull next to his station. He never reached it. Kavanaugh was on him. A fist, hardened by years of frustration, shot through the booth's open window and connected with Dobbs's jaw. The guard crumpled. Reese reached in, grabbed the heavy ring of keys from its hook, and tossed it back into Broadway where other men, now pouring from cell 3, snatched it up. The silence shattered. It was not replaced by shouts, but by a roar, a deep, collective sound of release that seemed to shake the concrete dust from the ceiling. Peters, struggling with Henderson, was swarmed. His baton was ripped from his belt. His whistle cord snapped. He was shoved, disoriented, into the open door of cell 1, and the door was slammed shut. The electronic lock was engaged. He was a prisoner in the very cell he had just opened. Chaos, but chaos with a purpose. The men streaming from the east end of the tier now turned into an organized mob. They did not rush for the main block exit. They knew it was a heavy, barred gate guarded from the outside. Instead, they moved to consolidate control of their own territory. Men with the keyring began frantically trying keys in the manual locks of the cell doors on the west end, doors that had not been opened for yard time. As each door swung open, more men joined the fray, a flood of blue denim and pale, furious faces. Some headed for the guard stations at either end of Broadway. The stations were empty. The guards there, hearing the roar, had followed protocol and retreated to secure the exterior exits, sealing the block from the outside. The inmates smashed the glass of the station windows, tearing out the telephones and alarm bells. They were cutting the nerves of the system. Within 3 minutes, the inmates controlled the interior of Condemned Row. Over 80 men now milled, shouted, and celebrated in the narrow corridor. The remaining guards, those who had been caught inside during the initial onslaught, were rounded up. There were 4 of them, including the dazed Dobbs, pulled from his booth. They were herded into a single cell at the center of the tier and locked in. The inmates now held hostages. The intoxicating, terrifying reality of their situation began to sink in. They had done the impossible. They had broken the silent system. The solid doors that had confined them now stood open, grotesque mouths gaping onto the corridor they now owned. But ownership of a sealed tomb is a hollow victory. They were still inside North Block. They had no tools, no weapons beyond a few captured batons. They had only the architecture of their own captivity and the leverage of the 4 men in the cell. A voice, louder than the others, rose above the din. It was Santora, the Wire. He climbed onto the base of one of the guard stations, holding a baton. "Listen, listen," he yelled. The crowd quieted, turning to him. "We got the block, but they got the prison. We need to talk. We need to tell them why." A list of grievances was hastily assembled from the shouted suggestions of the men. The unbearable overcrowding, the cancelled yard time and exercise, the chaotic and cruel rescheduling of execution dates, the inedible food, the lack of medical care. It was a bill of particulars against the purgatory they had endured. Santora pointed to the main block entrance, a massive steel-barred gate at the south end of Broadway. Beyond it was a short corridor, and then another gate leading to the main prison yard. We barricade this, we make our stand here. We send a message out. We demand the warden. The system's own design was turned against it. The solid steel cell doors, too heavy to move far, were of no use. But the contents of the cells were. Mattresses, thin and lumpy, were dragged out and piled against the main gate. The steel-framed bunks bolted to the floor were immovable, but the men used captured batons and sheer force to bend and break the thin legs of the spare floor mattresses' frames, creating jagged metal stakes. The waste buckets, recently emptied, were upended and added to the heap. It was a pathetic barricade, symbolic more than effective, but it served its purpose. It transformed the entrance from a portal controlled by the outside to a frontier held by the inside. A line was drawn. Then they sent their message. One of the younger inmates, a kid named Riley, with a voice not yet worn ragged by silence, was pushed to the front of the barricade. He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted through the bars, down the empty corridor, toward the distant outer gate where he knew guards would be gathering. "Hey, you out there, listen. We got 4 of your men in here. You bring the warden. We want to talk to the Warden Smith, you hear? Bring the warden, or you'll be carrying your boys out in boxes." The words, alien and bold after years of enforced quiet, echoed in the concrete chamber. Then they waited. The initial adrenaline began to ebb. The reality of their position settled in. They were 80-odd condemned men in a concrete box, with 4 hostages, facing the entire apparatus of the California prison system. The silence that returned was not the old oppressive one. It was the tense, breathless quiet of a held breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. In his office in the administrative building, Warden Court Smith was reviewing a budget request for additional ventilation fans in the kitchen when the telephone rang. It was the chief guard of the North Block, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Warden, we have a major disturbance, condemned row. Inmates have seized control of the tier. Guards are inside, unaccounted for. The block is sealed." Smith's mind, trained for procedure, did not leap to emotion. It leapt to logistics. "How many inmates out?" "It appears all of them, sir. The entire row population. 93. A cold knot formed in Smith's stomach. 93. The number from the morning count. The number that had been a quiet concern in reports was now a screaming crisis. "Hostages?" "We believe so, sir. We have visual from the outer gate. We can see a barricade at the inner gate. We can hear them. They're demanding to speak to you." Smith stood. His first thought, reflexively, was of the gas chamber. Was it secure? The irony was immediate and bitter. The centerpiece of his modern, humane system was utterly useless. You could not gas a cell block. The problem was not one of execution, but of insurrection. The machine for death had no setting for this. "Secure the chamber," he ordered, though he knew it was already done. "I want all available armed personnel to muster at the North Block yard entrance. No one enters the block. Establish a perimeter. I am on my way." As he walked briskly across the prison yard, the warm August sun feeling obscenely cheerful, Smith's mind raced through the protocol manual that existed only in his experience. This was unprecedented. The silent system was built on the premise of passive containment. Its failure modes were assumed to be individual. A suicide, a hunger strike, a single violent outburst. There was no chapter on collective revolt. The system's safeguards, the solid doors, the controlled movements, the isolation, had all failed simultaneously. The design flaw was now horrifically apparent. You could store human beings in silent isolation only as long as they accepted their status as stored objects. The moment they acted as a collective, as subjects, the architecture of control became a geography of rebellion. He arrived at the outer gate of North Block. A squad of guards, some with shotguns, others with rifles, stood in a tense semicircle. The chief guard pointed to the inner gate, 30 feet down a corridor. Smith could see the heap of mattresses and debris piled against it. He could see faces pressed against the bars behind the barricade. He could hear the murmur of many voices, a sound that seemed fundamentally wrong, emanating from condemned row. "They've repeated their demand, Warden," the chief guard said. They want to talk to you. They claim they have 4 of our men." Smith considered. Negotiation was a textbook response. But to what end? The state could not negotiate with condemned men over their conditions of confinement. The precedent would be catastrophic. The system's authority was absolute, or it was nothing. To parley would be to acknowledge their power, to admit the system could be bargained with. It would legitimize the revolt. Furthermore, every minute the block was under inmate control was a minute the myth of San Quentin's inviolability died a little more. The news would leak. The press would have a field day. His career and the future of the humane system he had built hung in the balance. His decision was swift and cold. The system would reassert control, not through dialogue, but through overwhelming force. The rebellion was a virus, it would be cauterized. "We do not negotiate," he said, his voice low and firm. "We retake the block. Prepare to use tear gas. Shotguns are to be used only if a guard's life is in immediate, mortal danger. Aim low if you must fire. We want those hostages back alive." He paused, looking at the barricade. "They have made their point. Now we will make ours." Inside the block, the mood was shifting from triumph to anxiety. The warden was here, but he wasn't talking. They could see the gathering of armed men. The reality of their tactical position was stark. They had no water beyond the sinks in their cells, no food beyond the morning's oatmeal, no way out. Their only leverage was the threat to the hostages, a threat many were unwilling to actually carry out. They were murderers, many of them, but this was different. This was cold-blooded, face-to-face killing of men who, however complicit in the system, were just doing a job. The solidarity began to fray. Arguments broke out. Some wanted to storm the outer gate, a suicidal charge. Others wanted to barricade themselves deeper in the cell block. Santora and Kavanaugh tried to maintain order, but they were convicts, not generals. The pressure that had united them was now turning inward. The assault came with a sudden, shocking violence. There was no warning shout, no final ultimatum. A canister, trailing white smoke, arced through the bars of the inner gate and clattered onto the concrete floor of Broadway. Tear gas. Then another, and another. The gas, designed for open spaces, filled the narrow corridor with a choking, blinding cloud. Men screamed, clawing at their eyes, stumbling into each other. The solid cell fronts, which had contained their whispers, now contained the gas, concentrating its effect. The barricade, they realized too late, was also a seal. The ventilation system for the block had been shut off from the outside. They were in a gas chamber of their own making. Coughing, retching, half-blind, they retreated from the gate, stumbling into open cells. But the gas followed. Then came the sound of sledgehammers against the gate's lock. Bang, bang, bang. A rhythmic, terrifying drumbeat. The inmates with the captured batons rallied near the barricade, ready to fight for the ground they had taken. Kavanaugh, his eyes streaming, grabbed a jagged piece of bunk frame. "Hold the line!" he roared, his voice a ragged scrape. With a final shriek of shearing metal, the lock gave way. The gate, blocked by the mattress barricade, only opened a foot. But it was enough. A shotgun barrel appeared in the gap, pointed at the ceiling. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space. Plaster dust rained down. "Lay down! Get down on the floor!" A guard's voice boomed from behind the gate. Some men dropped. Others, wild with fear and chemical agony, charged the opening. What followed was not a battle, but a brutal, chaotic reconquest. Guards in gas masks, wielding shotguns and riot clubs, forced their way through the gap, kicking aside the mattresses. They moved in a phalanx, disciplined and terrifying. The inmates, disorganized and half-blinded, fought with desperation, swinging bunk frames and batons. The air was a fog of gas, dust and gun smoke. The sound was a cacophony of shouts, curses, screams of pain, and the sickening thud of wood on flesh. Kavanaugh lunged at a masked guard. The guard sidestepped and brought his riot club down on Kavanaugh's shoulder. He heard the bone crack before he felt the pain. He fell. Santora, trying to rally a group near the central guard station, was hit in the chest by the stock of a shotgun. He crumpled, gasping for air that was full of poison. Isolated pockets of resistance flared and were brutally extinguished. Guards dragged men by their hair or their ankles, throwing them into open cells and slamming the doors. The system was reimposing its order, one brutal gesture at a time. The hostages were the priority. A team of guards fought their way to the cell where the 4 guards were held. The door was unlocked from the outside. The men stumbled out, coughing and weeping with relief, and were hurriedly escorted through the gauntlet and out of the block. With the hostages safe, the guards' actions grew even more forceful. The objective was now total subjugation. The fight lasted less than 20 minutes. The inmates were outnumbered, outgunned, and outorganized. One by one, they were beaten into submission, cuffed and thrown back into the cells from which they had erupted just hours before. The gas began to slowly clear, sucked out by fans now turned back on at full power, revealing a scene of devastation. Broadway was littered with debris, overturned buckets, torn mattresses. Smears of blood traced paths across the concrete floor. The air stank of sweat, gas, and fear. The final act was the count. But this was not the morning's quiet verification. This was an inventory of damage. Guards, their masks off now, faces grim and streaked with sweat, moved from cell to cell. They dragged inmates to the food ports, checking faces against the list, noting injuries. 3 men did not stand for the count. They lay on the floors of their cells, their blue denim shirts dark and wet with blood. Gunshot wounds. In the chaos, shotguns had been fired, not at the ceiling. The official report would later call it necessary force to protect officers and retake the facility. The number 3 would be entered into the log, inmate fatalities. Dozens more were injured, broken bones, concussions, lacerations. Several guards had also been seriously hurt, broken noses, cracked ribs, one with a deep gash on his scalp from a piece of metal bunk frame. The wounded were triaged. The inmates were treated last, their injuries catalogued with the same dispassion as their presence. The ringleaders were identified: Kavanaugh, Santora, Reese, Henderson, and a handful of others. They were not just thrown into cells, they were dragged to the hole, the disciplinary isolation cells in another part of the prison, where they were stripped, beaten again for good measure, and left in total darkness. By late afternoon, it was over. The gates of Condemned Row were sealed once more. The electronic locks were repaired and tested. A double guard detail armed with shotguns now patrolled Broadway. Inside the cells, the men sat or lay in the gloom. The silence had returned, but it was a different entity altogether. It was not the silence of control, but the silence of shock, of pain, of utter defeat. It was thick with the memory of the roar and the subsequent crash. The air still carried the acrid ghost of tear gas. The system had broken, violently, spectacularly. And then, with a relentless, brutal efficiency, it had repaired itself. The machine had jammed and had been cleared with a hammer. As night fell, the only sounds were the heavy tread of the extra guards and the occasional muffled groan from a cell. The revolt of August 21st, 1938 was over. The silent block had been silenced again. But the pressure that had built for years and had exploded in a few violent hours had not been released. It had simply been driven back behind thicker walls, where it would continue to simmer in the dark, waiting for the next inevitable flaw in the perfect, indifferent machine. The smoke cleared, but the silence that settled over Condemned Row was not the old, engineered quiet. It was the silence of a battlefield after the guns have stopped. It was a stunned, aching void, thick with the smells of blood, tear gas, and fear. The system had ruptured, and now it had to explain the wound. The first order of business was not healing, but narrative. The truth had to be processed, sanitized, and filed away. The investigations began within days, internal by the prison, external by a perfunctory committee from Sacramento. Their conclusions, arrived at with bureaucratic haste, were a masterpiece of misdirection. The official report, when it was released months later, was a dry, dense document that focused on material failures and individual pathologies. The primary cause was identified as severe overcrowding, a factual observation that nonetheless served as a perfect scapegoat. It was a hardware problem, not a software flaw. The report detailed the numbers: 93 men in a space for 70. It noted the strain on meal service and sanitation. It was a problem of volume, of plumbing and logistics. The second cause was the manipulative actions of a small group of desperate agitators. Men like Kavanaugh and Santora, with exhausted appeals and violent tendencies, had preyed upon the general discontent. The system itself, the philosophy of silent, indefinite warehousing, the psychological torment of legal limbo, the crushing sensory deprivation, was not indicted, it was absolved. The language was careful, clinical. The revolt was framed not as an inevitable eruption of human spirit under intolerable pressure, but as a security breach, a failure of physical, plant, and personnel vigilance. The psychological core of the silent system, its fundamental belief that men could be stored like inert objects, went unexamined. The inquiry was a whitewash but not a cover-up. It was something more insidious, a reframing. The event was categorized, given a case number, and placed in a file. The lesson learned was not "this is inhumane." The lesson learned was "this must be made stronger." The human cost was tallied in the same ledger as broken furniture: 3 inmates dead from gunshot wounds, 27 injured, some seriously, 4 guards seriously wounded, a dozen more with minor injuries. The prison hospital was busy for a week. The injured inmates were treated, patched up, and returned to their cells on the row as soon as they could walk. Their injuries were noted in their files, alongside their crimes and their appeal dates. They were parts that had been damaged during a mechanical failure, now repaired enough to be placed back in inventory. The ringleaders, those who could be identified from the guards' accounts, and the snitches who emerged in the aftermath, faced a swift and certain reckoning. Not a legal one, they were already condemned, but an administrative one. They were kept in the hole, the disciplinary isolation unit, for weeks, deprived of light, of exercise, of any human contact beyond the shoving of food through a slot. They were broken down, not for interrogation, but for decontamination. They were the infectious agents, and solitary was the autoclave. Then, one by one, over the next 2 years, they were fed back into the machine they had tried to seize. Their execution dates, which may have been delayed by the chaos, were rescheduled with a new grim punctuality. Their final walks from the row to the hospital basement were conducted with a heightened, coldly furious security. Double the guards, hands cuffed behind their backs, legs shackled. The last mile was now a gauntlet of hard eyes and clenched fists, but the ritual inside the chamber was unchanged. The silent nod, the lever pull, the hiss of gas, the 11-minute wait. The system, in its ultimate function, reasserted its dominance with chilling normality. The gas chamber, useless and irrelevant during the revolt, now proved its terrible point. It could not control the living, but it could absolutely process the dead. Frank Kavanaugh went in the spring of 1939. Mario Santora followed that summer. The others, over the months. Their deaths were not reported as the executions of rebels, but simply as the carrying out of lawful sentences. The system consumed them, and in doing so erased the political meaning of their final act. They died not as men who had defied the state, but as convicts whose appeals had run out. The paperwork was flawless. The pipeline, momentarily clogged, was now clear. With the agitators processed, the administration turned its full attention to ensuring such a clog would never happen again. The period from 1939 to 1941 saw a physical and philosophical fortification of condemned row. The revolt was not a reason to question the silent system. It was a manual for its improvement. Engineers and penologists pored over the events of August 21st, not to understand the despair, but to identify points of failure. Every weakness the inmates had exploited was analyzed and hardened. The solid steel cell doors, which had swung open to release chaos, were replaced with even thicker models. The new doors had smaller, reinforced food ports, just large enough for a tin plate to pass through, but too small for a man to get his arm out, let alone his head. The locking mechanisms were upgraded, with secondary manual deadbolts controlled only from the outside. The electronic sequential system was modified to allow guards to unlock cells individually, not just in sequence, eliminating the timing window the revolt had used. The guard stations at the ends of Broadway were rebuilt into true cages of heavy steel mesh, with bulletproof glass windows that could be sealed shut. The sightlines remained perfect, but the guards were now encased in armor. Inside the cells, anything that could be used as a tool or weapon was removed or redesigned. The thin steel bunk frames that had been broken into stakes were replaced with solid, welded slabs of iron integral to the cell structure. The mattresses were made of thinner, softer material that could not be used to barricade a gate. The waste buckets were replaced with flush toilets, but the plumbing was encased in steel sheathing to prevent tapping or whispering. Ventilation grills were covered with a finer, stronger mesh. The yard, the flashpoint of the initial grievance, was not expanded. Instead, its use was further restricted. Solitary exercise continued, but under the gaze of 2 armed guards in towers, with a third on the ground with a shotgun. The protocols were rewritten, adding layers of redundancy and paranoia. The guard force was increased. Training now included riot drills, with an emphasis on immediate, overwhelming force. The no conversation rule became even more absolute. Guards were cycled off the row more frequently to prevent the faintest hint of familiarity. The system's original goal, a kind of sterile, humane storage, was quietly subsumed by a new paramount objective: absolute security. The humanity of the occupant was now an even greater threat to be managed. The silent system had evolved. It was no longer just a waiting room for death. It was a fortress designed to contain the living will to resist that death. And the population, after a brief dip, began to climb again. The legal machinery of conviction and appeal ground on, indifferent to the renovations. Men continued to be sentenced to death, transported to San Quentin, and processed into the newly fortified condemned row. The war years saw a lull in executions, but not in arrivals. The row filled again, reaching its new hardened capacity. The gas chamber was used sporadically through the 1940s and 50s, its ritual a dark constant. Then came the legal challenges of the 1960s, culminating in the national moratorium following the 1972 Furman v. Georgia decision, which found arbitrary application of the death penalty unconstitutional. For a moment, the pipeline seemed severed. The men on condemned row had their sentences commuted to life imprisonment. Some were transferred off the row. A fragile, impossible hope flickered in the tomb. It was an illusion. California, like many states, rewrote its death penalty statute to meet the new constitutional standards. In 1978, it was reinstated. The pipeline was repaired, its valves and pumps updated for a new era. The gas chamber, now seen as potentially cruel, was eventually replaced by lethal injection, an even more medical, more administrative procedure. But the foundational logic, the philosophy perfected in the aftermath of 1938, remained untouched. The purpose was still storage. The method was still silence, isolation, and control. The men were still catalogued and warehoused, their humanity secondary to their status as condemned property. San Quentin's death row itself eventually moved. The old North Block, with its fortified condemned row, was retired. In its place rose new massive facilities, the adjustment center, and later the sprawling modern death row complex that could house over 700 condemned men. The technology advanced. The 4A8-foot cells were replaced with slightly larger but similarly configured concrete and steel boxes. Solid doors gave way to perforated steel, but the principle of front-facing isolation remained. The guards now monitored from control booths filled with video screens, tracking movements via computerized sensors. Meals were delivered through secure slots. Exercise was in individual wire mesh dog runs. The library was digital, restricted, and monitored. The silence was no longer enforced by a rule against talking. It was engineered by architecture that prevented meaningful contact. Men lived for decades in a state of supermax-style solitary confinement, their appeals winding through a legal system even more complex and sluggish than the one in 1938. The scale had multiplied tenfold, but the song remained the same. It was a hymn of suspended animation, sung in a hum of fluorescent lights and the soft click of electronic locks. The revolt of August 21, 1938, did not survive in the institutional memory of San Quentin. It became a footnote, a curious anomaly in prison histories, rarely mentioned on official tours. The polished narrative of progress, from the noose to the gas chamber to the lethal injection, from the old cell blocks to the modern secure housing, had no place for a story that revealed the system's core contradiction. The violence of that day was not a rebellion against cruelty, but against indifference. It was the sound of the human spirit smashing against the walls of a perfectly administered hell. And the system's victory was that it learned to build thicker walls, not to question the hell. Today, if you stand outside the modern death row facility at San Quentin, you see a vast, silent, windowless complex. It is a monument not to justice, but to containment. Inside, a man might spend 20-30 years in a cell, waiting. His world is the same 488 rhythm of the 1930s, amplified by technology and scale. He is tracked, counted, and maintained. His appeals flicker on computer screens. His existence is a testament to the enduring power of the idea born in the wake of the 1934 gas chamber and hardened in the blood of the 1938 revolt, that a human being can be processed, that he can be stripped of his narrative, his community, his voice, and reduced to a case number in a state of endless, silent pending. The philosophical verdict is this: the most resilient and terrifying system of control is not one built on overt brutality, but one built on flawless, indifferent administration. Overt cruelty creates martyrs and galvanizes opposition, but a system that operates with the cold efficiency of a spreadsheet, that reduces profound moral questions to issues of logistics and security, that meets human resistance not with rage, but with a procedural upgrade, that system is almost impossible to dismantle. It presents itself not as evil, but as necessity, not as vengeance, but as justice. The silent system at San Quentin revealed that the attempt to engineer the humanity out of state-sponsored death does not eliminate humanity. It merely distills it into its most volatile, desperate form. The revolt was that volatility igniting, but the system's ultimate triumph was its ability to absorb that explosion, to study it, and to incorporate its lessons into a stronger, more impervious design. The pressure of 93 men in 1938 became the pressure of 700 men today. The silence demanded is now engineered, not just enforced. The will to resist is not gone. It is buried under layers of concrete, procedure, and time. The gas chamber is a museum piece. The new machinery of death is a medical gurney. But the waiting room is eternal. The final, chilling legacy of the San Quentin death row revolt is that it proved the system could break, and in breaking, could learn how never to break again. It is a monument to the belief that humanity can be indefinitely stored, a belief that turns prisons into tombs and justice into a silent, endless, administrative wait. The credits roll not on a resolution, but on a perpetual, humming stasis. The silence endures.